It started out as just another solo camping trip, something I did to escape from the constant noise and chaos of city life. I had planned everything, packed my tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, water, and even a first aid kit. The area I chose was remote but familiar. Deep in the woods, about 3 hours from the nearest town. I camped there before and never had an issue. It was peaceful, untouched, the kind of place where you can sit by the fire and hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the crackle of burning logs. I parked my car at the end of a dirt trail, shouldered my backpack, and started hiking in. The air was crisp and cool, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. It was late afternoon, and I figured I had about 2 hours of daylight left to find a spot, set up camp, and get a fire going. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, but the path was easy enough to follow. I wasn't in a rush. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird fluttering through the branches above. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. No phone calls, no traffic, no people. Just me and the woods. I found a spot near a small clearing, close to a shallow creek. The ground was flat, the trees provided some cover, and there was plenty of firewood lying around. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some dry wood, and started a fire as the sun dipped lower in the sky. I cooked a simple meal, just some canned soup heated over the fire, ate slowly, and watched the sky turn from orange to deep purple, then black. As the fire crackled and the stars came out, I leaned back against a log and let myself relax. The air was colder now, but the fire kept me warm. The woods felt alive around me. I could hear the creek bubbling nearby, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the darkness. Nothing out of the ordinary, not yet. After a while, I put out the fire and crawled into my tent. I zipped up my sleeping bag, turned off my headlamp, and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I slept before something woke me. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I lay there perfectly still, listening. The woods were dead silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing. My heart started to pound in my chest. Something felt wrong. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and close, too close. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My mind raced. Couldn't be an animal. These were human footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, like someone was trying to be quiet but couldn't completely mask the sound. I stayed perfectly still, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps started again, circling my tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I reached for my knife, which I kept next to my sleeping bag, and gripped it tightly. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I didn't know what to do. If I unzipped the tent, I'd give away my position. But if I stayed inside, I was a sitting duck. The footsteps stopped again, right in front of the tent. Then, slowly, the zipper on the tent started to move. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I shouted, "Hey, who's there?" The zipper stopped. There was silence again, thick and suffocating. Then, the footsteps retreated, slowly at first, then faster. I listened until they faded into the distance. I sat there in the dark, knife in hand, heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who the hell was out there? And why were they messing with my tent? I waited for what felt like hours, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. Eventually, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my knife still in hand. The woods were still dark and quiet. The fire pit was cold, the creek still bubbling softly in the distance. I scanned the area with my headlamp, but there was no sign of anyone. No tracks, no disturbed ground, nothing. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire pit, knife in hand, jumping at every little sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail stayed empty. When I finally reached my car, I threw my backpack in the trunk, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking. I turned the key in the ignition and drove out of there, gravel crunching under the tires. It wasn't until I was back on the main road, miles away from the woods, that I started to feel normal again. I never figured out who or what was out there that night. Part of me wants to believe it was just some lost hiker, someone who didn't mean any harm. But deep down, I know that's not true. Whoever it was, they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't lost. They were watching me. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. It was supposed to be a weekend to clear my mind. Just me, the woods, and 2 nights of solitude. I had been feeling burnt out for weeks, and I thought some fresh air and peace would do me good. I packed light, a tent, sleeping bag, a few days worth of food, my knife, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my phone. The forecast looked clear, and the national forest was only a 2-hour drive away. The plan was simple. I'd hike about 6 miles in, find a good spot near the creek, and camp there for 2 nights. No service, no distractions, just nature and me. The drive was peaceful. The farther I got from the city, the more I felt that weight in my chest ease up. Trees lined both sides of the narrow road, their branches reaching out like arms. By the time I parked at the trailhead, it was mid-afternoon. I strapped on my pack, locked my car, and hit the trail. The first few miles were easy. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, and the sun filtered through the trees in soft beams. Birds called from somewhere high above, their songs mixing with the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. Every so often, I'd stop to take a sip of water and listen to the wind rustle the leaves. I found my campsite just before the trail started to climb steeply. It was a flat patch of ground near the creek, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. The water gurgled softly, and there was a fallen log nearby that would make a perfect bench. I set down my pack and started setting up camp. The tent went up easily, and I laid out my sleeping bag inside. After gathering some firewood, I built a small fire pit with rocks and got a fire going. The sun was starting to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I heated up a can of chili over the fire and ate slowly, watching the sky turn from orange to deep blue. By the time the stars came out, the air had cooled, and the woods were alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs. I felt calm, almost peaceful, in a way I hadn't for months. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames, then crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the sound of the creek. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the woods were quiet except for the creek. I lay there for a moment, listening. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Maybe 20 or 30 yards away, just beyond the circle of trees around my campsite. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. I listened for a minute longer, but the sound didn't come back. Satisfied, I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept picturing the dark woods beyond my tent, wondering what could be out there. Every little rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off again. I woke up with the sun. The air was cold, and the fire had long since died out. I climbed out of my tent, stretched, and put some water on to boil for coffee. The woods felt different in the daylight. Less mysterious, more familiar. Still, something felt off. The ground around my campsite looked disturbed. Not in a major way, just a few patches of flattened grass, some broken twigs. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered through in the night. After breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. I followed the creek upstream for a while, keeping an eye out for wildlife. The woods were beautiful, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden shafts. I found a small clearing with wildflowers and sat there for a while, enjoying the quiet. When I got back to camp, I noticed something strange. My food bag, which I had hung from a tree to keep it away from animals, was lying on the ground. The rope was still tied to the branch, but the bag had been ripped open. Most of the food was gone. My stomach tightened. Bears were known to be in the area, but this didn't look like a bear. It looked deliberate. I checked the ground around the tree. There were no tracks, no claw marks, nothing to suggest an animal had been there. That night, I couldn't relax. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. I kept the fire burning brighter and longer than I normally would, feeding it stick after stick until the flames danced high into the air. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of leaves. This time, it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but saw nothing. The sound stopped as soon as the light hit the woods. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Then it started again off to my right. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I called out, my voice steady but loud. Hello, nothing. The footsteps stopped. The woods were silent again, except for the crackle of the fire and the rushing water. I didn't sleep much after that. I sat by the fire, clutching my knife, and waited for dawn. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. Something or someone was out there, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what they wanted. I packed up my gear quickly, stuffing everything into my pack. The woods felt oppressive, the trees closing in around me. My skin prickled with the feeling of being watched. As I started back down the trail, I kept checking over my shoulder. The feeling didn't go away. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. The hike back felt longer than it should have. My legs ached, and my heart was pounding the whole time. About a mile from the trailhead, I entered a wide clearing. The sun was high overhead, and the open space felt like a relief after the dense woods. I paused to catch my breath, feeling a little safer in the sunlight. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the clearing, there was a single footprint. It wasn't mine. It was fresh, pressed deep into the soft dirt. A bare human footprint. I froze, my eyes scanning the tree line. The woods were silent, too silent. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the trees. My pulse was racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I gripped the knife in my pocket, my fingers slick with sweat. Then, without a sound, something moved in the shadows. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran, my pack bouncing on my shoulders, my legs burning with every step. Branches whipped at my face, and rocks bit into my boots, but I didn't stop. The trailhead was just ahead. I could see my car through the trees, gleaming in the sunlight. I burst out of the woods and sprinted to my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, unlocking the door and throwing my pack into the back seat. As I slammed the door and started the engine, I glanced back at the trailhead. The woods stood silent and still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I didn't see anyone, but I knew deep down that someone had been there, watching, waiting. I drove away, my tires kicking up dust on the gravel road. I didn't look back. Even now, I can't explain what happened in those woods. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. But every time I closed my eyes, I see that single footprint in the clearing, and I know that whoever left it is still out there, waiting. I've always loved camping. There's something peaceful about being away from the noise of life and just sitting under the stars. This time was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. I thought it would be another weekend trip like any other. Just me, the trees, the sounds of nature, and some quiet. I had chosen a spot deep in the woods, about 3 hours from town. It wasn't a popular campground, which is why I liked it. No other campers to bother me, no loud groups partying at the fire pit, just quiet solitude. I had parked my truck at the trailhead and hiked about 5 miles in, carrying everything I needed on my back. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a small camp stove. The hike in was peaceful. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through tall pines and dense brush. It was late afternoon when I finally reached the clearing I'd picked out on the map. A small flat area near a creek. Perfect. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and gathered some firewood for the night. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, I had a small fire going. The smell of wood smoke filled the air, and I sat back against a fallen log, eating a simple meal of instant noodles and beef jerky. It was calm. The sky darkened to a deep blue, stars slowly appearing one by one. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the steady trickle of the creek nearby. But then, as I sat there enjoying the quiet, I heard something else. A rustling in the brush, maybe 20 or 30 yards away. At first, I didn't think much of it. Probably just a deer. This was the woods, after all. Animals were everywhere. But the rustling didn't stop. It wasn't the light, random noise of a small animal moving through leaves. It was steady, deliberate. I leaned forward, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. My headlamp was still in the tent, but even if I had it, I wasn't sure I wanted to turn it on just yet. Something about the sound made me feel uneasy. It stopped. The woods were silent again, except for the crackling of the fire and the bubbling creek. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind moving through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rest of the night was uneventful. I crawled into my tent around 10, zipping up the flap and rolling into my sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow on the canvas of the tent. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly. It was pitch black inside the tent. My watch read 2:47 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dry leaves outside. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed. My heart started to race. The footsteps were slow, measured, circling the tent. Whoever or whatever it was wasn't in a hurry. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady breathing. It wasn't an animal. It was a person. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, my mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail. I hadn't passed any campsites on the way in. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the distance until the woods were silent again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching the small knife I always kept in my pack. Every little sound made my heart jump. I waited for the footsteps to return, but they never did. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I crawled out of the tent, my body stiff from lying in the same position for hours. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only a pile of cold ashes. I scanned the area around the campsite, looking for any sign of what or who had been there. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and it was hard to tell if there were any fresh footprints. But I did find something. About 10 feet from the tent, a small pile of rocks had been carefully stacked on top of each other. 5 or 6 stones, balanced neatly in a column, that hadn't been there when I set up camp. My stomach tightened. This wasn't just some random hiker passing through. Someone had been watching me. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The hike back to the trailhead felt twice as long as it had on the way in. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but the trail remained empty. The woods were eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my pack into the back and locked the doors the second I climbed in. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't think I want to know. All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again. Some things are better left unexplored. And as I drove away, watching the dense forest disappear in my rearview mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I love camping. I always have. Something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature with no city lights, no noise, and no distractions. It feels pure, like a reset button for your mind. You can breathe out there, really breathe. At least that's how I used to feel before my last trip. It was late October when I decided to head out to the northern woods. I'd been under a lot of stress at work, and life just felt like it was closing in on me. I needed to get away, badly. The trees and the fresh air seemed like the perfect remedy. I packed up my gear, threw everything into my truck, and hit the road early on a Friday morning. The drive took about 4 hours. It wasn't a well-known camping spot. It wasn't even marked on most maps. I had found it a few years ago by accident while exploring, and since then, it had become my favorite place to escape. It was deep in the woods, far from any trails or other campers. No cell service, no people, just me and the wilderness. Perfect. By the time I arrived, the sun was sitting low on the horizon, casting a soft golden light through the trees. The air was cool, with just enough bite to remind me that winter wasn't far off. I parked my truck at the edge of a narrow dirt path and grabbed my gear. It was about a mile hike to the spot I had in mind, right by a small, clear stream with a flat clearing for my tent. The hike was peaceful. Leaves crunched under my boots, and birds flitted between the trees. I kept my eyes peeled for deer or maybe a fox, but the woods seemed unusually quiet. Still, I didn't think much of it at the time. I just figured it was the season. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped below the trees, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some firewood, and built a small fire. The warmth felt good as the temperature dropped with the fading light. I cooked some canned chili over the fire and sat back, enjoying the calm. It wasn't long before the woods around me turned pitch black. Out there, away from city lights, the darkness is total. My fire created a small bubble of light, but beyond that, it was like staring into a wall of black. I've camped in the dark plenty of times before, but that night, it felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy.
Oppressive.
I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and reading too much into things. But then I started hearing noises. At first, it was just the sound of leaves rustling. Not unusual in the woods, but it felt too deliberate, like footsteps. I froze, straining my ears. The sound stopped. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and shook my head. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. I stirred the fire, letting the crackling flames push back the darkness. The footsteps started again. This time they were closer, I shot to my feet, holding my flashlight in one hand and my camping knife in the other. My heart was pounding in my chest. I swept the beam of light across the trees, but there was nothing, just the empty woods. Probably an animal, I told myself, though my voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to my own ears. Maybe a raccoon or a deer, definitely not a bear. I would have heard more noise if it were that big. I sat back down, but I couldn't relax. Every little sound set me on edge. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves. It all felt like it was creeping closer. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the darkness. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I doused the fire and climbed into my tent. Lying there in the dark, every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay alert. I gripped the knife tightly in my hand, listening for any sound. The footsteps came back, soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Then louder, closer. They circled my tent. Slowly, deliberately, I held my breath, my pulse thundering in my ears. Whatever it was, it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. They don't circle you. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? Maybe a hunter who stumbled onto my sight? But why would they be sneaking around like that? Why not just call out or show themselves? The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I tightened my grip on the knife, every muscle in my body tense. My brain was screaming at me to do something, anything, but fear kept me frozen in place. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, slowly, fading into the distance until they disappeared completely. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I just shoved everything into my bag, doused the last embers of the fire, and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could without running. The whole way back, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But the woods were quiet again, almost too quiet. When I finally reached my truck, I tossed my gear in the back and jumped into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking as I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I drove away. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, back in cell service range, that I finally started to breathe normally again. I never figured out who or what was out there that night. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't think I ever will. The plan was simple: 3 nights of camping by myself. I had been planning it for months, counting down the days. Dry Pine Camp was deep in the national forest, far from the noise of the city and the constant hum of modern life. I needed that kind of solitude, a mental reset. The first 2 days were perfect. The forest was quiet. The air smelled of pine and fresh dirt, and the sound of the wind moving through the tall trees was calming. I spent most of my time hiking along trails that didn't seem to get much use anymore, cooking over a small fire at night, and falling asleep to the sounds of crickets and distant owls. The first night, I slept like a rock. The second night, I woke up once to some rustling nearby, but I figured it was just a raccoon or a deer passing through. It was normal. Animals moved around at night. I wasn't worried. But the third night, that night changed everything. I woke up early that morning, feeling a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but something felt different. The air was still heavier than it had been the past 2 days. Even the birds seemed quieter, their songs scattered and half-hearted. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. After all, I'd spent almost 3 full days without seeing another person. I brewed some coffee over my camp stove and forced myself to relax. By late afternoon, I decided to hike one last trail before packing up in the morning. It was about 5 miles out and back, following a narrow path that wound along a ridge overlooking the valley below. The trail was rough and overgrown in places, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. About halfway into the hike, I came across something strange. A single boot lying in the middle of the trail. It was muddy and scuffed up, the leather cracked from exposure. It looked like it had been there for a while. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, but there was nothing particularly unusual about it aside from the fact that it was missing its pair. Probably just some hiker who lost it, I thought, tossing it off to the side of the trail. But as I kept walking, that uneasy feeling from earlier came creeping back. I reached the end of the trail around 4 p.m., just as the sun started dipping lower in the sky. The view from the ridge was incredible, miles of dense forest stretching out in every direction, the light turning golden as it filtered through the trees. I stood there for a while, enjoying the silence before turning back toward camp. I hadn't gone more than a few hundred yards when I noticed something strange off to the side of the trail. A campsite, but it wasn't just any campsite. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was a tent partially collapsed with the front flap hanging open. A backpack lay on its side, its contents scattered across the ground. A sleeping bag, some clothes, a water bottle, and a few other odds and ends. At first, I thought someone might still be around, but after calling out and waiting for a response, it became clear that the site was empty. I walked closer, trying to make sense of it. The tent looked like it had been there for weeks, maybe longer. The fabric was dirty and torn in places, and the food wrappers littering the ground had been picked clean by animals. It didn't make any sense. Who would leave their gear behind like that? I didn't want to hang around for long. The sun was sinking fast, and I still had a couple of miles to go. I turned and started back down the trail, moving a little quicker than before. That uneasy feeling was back, stronger than ever. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing, just the trees and the fading light. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The abandoned campsite was weird, sure, but there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe a hiker got lost and never came back for their stuff. Maybe they got injured and had to leave it behind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I made it back to my camp just as the last light disappeared behind the trees. I was tired, my legs sore from the hike, but I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched. I lit a small fire and tried to relax, but every little noise made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps in the distance, slow, deliberate, and too heavy to be an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the darkness, but the beam only reached so far. Beyond that, the forest was an endless black void. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I stood up, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. My flashlight shook in my hand as I pointed it toward the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. No response. The footsteps stopped. I knew I wouldn't sleep that night, not after that. I packed up what I could, shoving everything into my backpack as fast as possible. I left the tent. It wasn't worth the time it would take to break it down. With my pack on my shoulders and my flashlight in hand, I started down the trail that led back to the parking area. It was only about 2 miles, but it felt like 10. Every step echoed in the silence. Every shadow seemed to move. About halfway there, I heard the footsteps again. Behind me, slow and steady, matching my pace. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally saw the parking lot, I almost cried with relief. My car was the only one there, its metal frame glowing faintly in the moonlight. I sprinted the last 100 yards, fumbling with my keys as I unlocked the door and threw my pack into the back seat. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it. For a few seconds, I just sat there, breathing hard, my hands gripping the steering wheel. Then, in the rearview mirror, I saw something move at the edge of the trees. a figure tall and thin, standing just barely within the shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I started the car, threw it into reverse, and peeled out of the lot, my tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow forest road. It wasn't until I was 20 miles down the road that I finally started to calm down. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. I never went back to Dry Pine Camp. Couldn't. For weeks afterward, I scoured the news, looking for any reports of missing hikers or strange occurrences in the area. But there was nothing.
No answers.
To this day, I still don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is that I wasn't alone. I didn't know what I was really looking for that weekend. Maybe it was space to breathe. Maybe I just wanted to get away from the endless stream of texts, calls, emails, the feeling of being trapped in a world where everything moved too fast. I just knew I needed some quiet, some solitude. So I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, my hiking boots, and enough supplies for a couple of days. I chose a spot deep in the national forest, somewhere far enough from the usual campsites but not totally off-grid. I didn't want to risk getting completely lost. There was a stretch of old logging trails I remembered from a hike years ago, rough but passable. I thought it would be perfect. Remote but not dangerous. Quiet but not deserted. The drive out was peaceful. The air grew cooler the farther I got from town, and the smell of pine trees filled my truck. I rolled down the windows, letting the wind whip through. No music, just the hum of the tires on the gravel road and the occasional chirp of birds. After an hour or so, I reached the spot where the trail split off from the main road. I parked on the side, checked my gear, and set off. The trail was faint, overgrown in places but still visible. The trees towered on either side, casting long shadows even though it was barely midday. I walked for about 3 miles, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease with each step. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling to each other, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant trickle of a stream. I found a flat spot near a clearing, close to the stream but not too close to risk flooding if it rained. Felt right. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without trouble, and I gathered some firewood from the surrounding area. There was plenty of dry wood scattered around, enough to keep a fire going well into the night. After everything was set up, I sat on a fallen log, staring at the flames as they crackled and popped. The first night was uneventful, peaceful even. I cooked a simple meal, just a can of soup and some bread, then lay back and watched the stars come out. It was one of those nights where the sky seemed impossibly big, every star sharp and bright. I fell asleep to the sound of the stream and the occasional hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling more rested than I had in months. The air was cold and crisp, and my breath puffed out in little clouds as I made coffee over the fire. I planned to spend the day exploring the area, maybe follow the stream and see where it led. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a map, then headed out. The stream was easy to follow at first, winding gently through the trees. The ground was soft but firm, covered in moss and fallen leaves. After a while, the terrain grew steeper, the stream cutting through a narrow ravine. I had to scramble over rocks and fallen logs, but it was worth it. About 2 hours in, I found a small waterfall tucked away in a hollow. The water spilled over a ledge of smooth rock, pooling into a clear basin before continuing down the ravine. It was beautiful, untouched. I sat there for a while, eating a granola bar and listening to the water. That's when I noticed the sudden absence of sound. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. The birds had stopped singing. The breeze had stilled. Even the sound of the stream seemed muted, as if the forest was holding its breath. It wasn't just quiet, it was wrong. I tried to shake it off, blaming it on nerves or maybe just the natural stillness of the woods. But the feeling stayed with me as I made my way back to camp. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something. Someone. Behind me, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. When I got back to camp, everything looked the same as I'd left it. The fire pit, the tent, my gear, it was all there, untouched. But the feeling of unease lingered. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just spooking myself out for no reason. I forced myself to eat dinner, though I wasn't hungry, then sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. The sounds of the forest slowly returned. The chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, but they felt distant, like a recording played through a bad speaker. I went to bed early, hoping sleep would take the edge off my nerves. Didn't. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart racing. First, I didn't know why. The tent was pitch black, and for a few disoriented seconds, I thought I was still dreaming. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of footsteps just outside. My breath caught in my throat. Deer, I told myself. Or a raccoon, maybe a coyote. But the footsteps were too deliberate, too heavy. They circled the tent once, twice, then stopped right by the entrance. I lay there, every muscle tensed, barely breathing. My knife was in my pack, just out of reach. The footsteps started again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I didn't move for what felt like hours, every sound amplified in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. Morning came pale and cold. I crawled out of the tent, half expecting to find footprints or some other sign of what had been there. But there was nothing. The ground around the tent was undisturbed, the fire pit cold and still. I told myself it must have been an animal, that I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I spent the day close to camp, gathering more firewood and checking my gear. I kept glancing into the trees, expecting to see movement. The woods felt different now, less welcoming. That night, I made the fire bigger than usual, feeding it constantly until the flames danced high. The shadows flickered and shifted around me, and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I was just about to call it a night when I heard it again, those same deliberate footsteps coming from the trees. I grabbed my knife, holding it tight as I scanned the darkness. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking. No answer, just the sound of footsteps getting closer. I backed toward the fire, the heat at my back. My eyes darted around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever or whoever was out there. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting, but nothing happened. Eventually, I sat down by the fire, knife still in hand, and waited for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't bother eating or making coffee. I just wanted to get out. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long as it had on the way in. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me whip around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was never anyone there. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out, gravel flying. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles down the road, back in the safety of civilization, that I finally let myself breathe. I still don't know what it was, animal, person, my own overactive imagination. But I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. It all started as a simple plan, a weekend escape into the mountains. I'd been feeling burned out lately, and nothing seemed like a better idea than grabbing my gear and heading out into the quiet woods for some fresh air and solitude. I planned on hiking to a remote spot I had read about online, a place far off the beaten trail where I wouldn't run into anyone. Exactly what I needed. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials. My tent, sleeping bag, some dehydrated meals, plenty of water, a knife, a flashlight, and a map. I don't rely much on GPS out there. Batteries die and service can be spotty. The map was an old school one, creased and worn, but it gave me a sense of security. I left on a Friday afternoon. The drive to the trailhead was longer than I expected. Winding roads, gravel crunching under my tires, and the occasional gust of wind rocking my car. When I finally pulled up, there was only one other car parked there. An old green sedan with mud splattered along the sides. It looked like it had been there for a while, but there was no one in sight. The trail started off easy. Tall pines rose up on both sides, their needles muffling my footsteps. I could hear birds above, the distant rush of a creek, and nothing else. Just peace. I walked for miles, letting my mind wander, feeling the tension melt away with every step. The trail narrowed and began to climb steadily. After about 4 hours, I reached the spot I'd been aiming for. A small clearing on a ridge with a perfect view of the valley below. The sun was just starting to set, turning the sky a deep orange. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and sat down on a fallen log to eat. The air was cooling quickly, and a slight breeze picked up, rustling the leaves. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and watched the sun dip below the horizon. I felt completely alone out there in the best possible way. The first night was uneventful. I slept deeply, waking up only once when something rustled outside the tent. Probably just a raccoon or some other small animal. I told myself not to worry and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, brewed some coffee over my camp stove, and decided to explore a bit. I left my main pack at the campsite, taking only a small day pack with water, a snack, and my map. The trail continued past my camp, winding deeper into the forest. The trees were denser here, their branches nearly blocking out the sky. I hiked for a couple of hours, feeling more and more isolated with each step. That's when I noticed something odd. The trail split into two paths, one heading up a steep hill, the other veering down toward a dry creek bed. The map didn't show any fork in the trail, which didn't make sense. I hesitated, glancing back the way I'd come, but curiosity got the better of me. I chose the downhill path, thinking it would be easier to find my way back if I stuck close to the creek. First, it was fine. The path was narrow and overgrown, but there were enough signs of previous hikers, footprints in the dirt, broken branches, that I felt confident. After about an hour, though, the trail started to fade. The footprints disappeared, and the brush grew thicker. I told myself it was no big deal. I could always retrace my steps. Then I found the campsite. It wasn't like mine. This one was older, abandoned. A collapsed tent lay half-buried under leaves and dirt. Rusted cans and bits of cloth were scattered around, along with a broken camp stove. I walked closer, my heart starting to beat a little faster. It looked like no one had been here for years. The tent fabric was shredded, almost like it had been ripped apart. I stood there for a while, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an old site that had been left to rot, but something about it felt wrong, like whoever had been here had left in a hurry. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided to head back to my camp. I marked a tree with a small notch from my knife to make sure I'd recognize the spot again, then turned around and started back up the trail. That's when I realized the trail looked different. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth thicker. I followed the path uphill for what felt like forever, but I didn't recognize anything. I should have reached the main trail by now. Panic started to creep in. I forced myself to take a deep breath and pulled out my map. I traced the route with my finger, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The problem was the map didn't match what I was seeing. It was like the landscape had shifted. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig, made me whip my head around. I knew I wasn't far from my camp. I just had to find it before dark. Then I saw the mark I'd made on the tree. My heart sank. I had walked in a circle. I stood there, staring at the notch in the bark, trying to think. My water was almost gone, and the temperature was dropping fast. I knew I had two options: stay put and hope I could find my way back in the morning, or keep moving and risk getting even more lost. I chose to keep moving. I angled downhill, figuring I'd eventually hit the creek again. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my throat dry. The forest seemed endless. The sky was dark now, the only light coming from my flashlight. Its beam flickered and danced across the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. Then, finally, I heard it, the sound of running water. Relief washed over me, and I hurried toward it. The creek was shallow and slow-moving, but it was enough to help me get my bearings. I followed it upstream, praying it would lead me back to familiar ground. Didn't. Instead, it led me to something worse. The campsite. Not my campsite. The old, abandoned one. I stood there, breathing hard, my flashlight beam sweeping over the collapsed tent and scattered debris. How the hell had I ended up back here? I backed away, my hands trembling. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe I'd crossed the creek without realizing it and looped back around. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I had followed the creek in the opposite direction. I didn't want to spend the night there, but I didn't have much choice. My legs felt like lead, and I was too exhausted to keep going. I cleared a spot near the edge of the clearing, far from the old tent, and built a small fire. The warmth helped a little, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every crackle of the fire, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. A branch snapping, footsteps in the distance. I told myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like it. By morning, I was done. I didn't care about the hike anymore. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I followed the creek again, moving faster this time, not caring if I tripped or stumbled. The forest seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in on me. Then, out of nowhere, I broke through the trees and found myself back on the main trail. The relief was overwhelming. I almost laughed out loud. I knew I wasn't far from the trailhead now. I could make it back to my car before noon if I hurried. I started walking, my pace quickening with each step. The forest seemed less oppressive now, the sunlight filtering through the trees. I could hear birds again, the distant hum of the wind. For the first time in hours, I felt safe. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was still there. The old green sedan was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw my gear in the back, started the engine, and peeled out of there without looking back. My hands were shaking the whole drive home. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe I got turned around. Maybe I was just sleep-deprived and imagining things. But no matter how many times I tell myself that, it doesn't change the feeling I had in that clearing. The feeling that someone or something had been watching me, and the fact that I never saw who it was. I always loved camping, the feeling of being out in the wild, away from everything. No emails, no traffic, just the sound of the trees shifting in the wind and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. That was my kind of escape. So when I finally got a weekend free from work, I packed up my gear, filled my cooler, and drove up north to a remote area I'd scouted months before. The place was about 3 hours from home, deep in the woods, far from any marked campsites. That was the appeal. No other campers, no kids screaming, no sound of generators humming from RVs, just nature. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and started hiking in. The trail was barely visible, just a faint path through the underbrush, but I'd marked it on my GPS. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the birds seemed to disappear, leaving only the crunch of my boots and my breathing. After about 2 hours, I reached a small clearing near a slow-moving creek. It was perfect. The ground was level. There were thick trees on all sides blocking the wind, and the water source was close. I set my pack down, stretched out my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. By late afternoon, I had my tent up, firewood collected, and a small fire going. I cooked a quick meal, just some canned stew heated over the flames, ate, and sat back to enjoy the peace. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky shades of orange and pink. I didn't see a single plane overhead. That's how far out I was, completely cut off. Night fell and the temperature dropped. I stoked the fire and zipped up my jacket. The only sounds now were the occasional pop from the burning wood and the trickle of the creek. It was peaceful, but then I heard something, a rustling in the trees maybe 50 yards away. It was slow, deliberate, not the random crunch of an animal moving through the brush, but something steady. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I exhaled and told myself it was just a deer, maybe even a bear, though I'd seen no signs of one. I forced myself to relax, but my body wouldn't. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something again, but it was always faint, just on the edge of my hearing. I kept glancing into the dark, past the firelight, but saw nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped myself inside. My sleeping bag was warm, and despite the uneasy feeling, my exhaustion won. I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. Something had snapped a branch outside. Close. My heart pounded in my ears. I lay still, barely breathing, listening. The night was silent again. I reached for my flashlight but stopped. If someone or something was out there, I didn't want to give away my position. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of my campfire crackling. That was wrong. I had put the fire out before going to bed. I shot up, unzipping my tent as quietly as I could, and peeked out. The fire was burning low, just a few flames licking at the wood. My first thought was that I hadn't put it out properly, but that wasn't possible. I had dumped water on it. Someone had restarted it. I scanned the darkness, every nerve in my body on edge. My gear was still there, my pack, my cooler, everything, but something felt off, like the forest itself was watching me. I grabbed my knife and my flashlight, stepped out, and turned in a slow circle. The beam of my flashlight cut through the trees, but there was nothing. I listened for movement, for breathing, for anything. The fire popped behind me, making me jump. My hands were shaking. I stood there for a long time, staring into the dark. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe a stray ember had caught some dry wood and reignited. Maybe. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted, but the fear from the night before seemed distant, like a bad dream. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was just on edge from being alone so deep in the woods. I made some coffee, ate a protein bar, and tried to enjoy the morning. But then I saw it. There were footprints near my tent. Human footprints. They circled my campsite, leading to the trees and disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here, watching me. I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't eat, didn't even put out the fire properly. I just dumped water on it, threw everything into my pack, and started hiking out. My hands were sweating, even though the air was cold. Every step, I expected to hear someone following me. I don't know how long I hiked. The trail felt longer than before, winding endlessly through the trees. My back ached from the weight of my pack, but I didn't stop. I just kept going. When I finally saw my truck, relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I tossed my pack in the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled out onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I drove straight home without stopping. When I finally got back, I locked every door and window in my house. I didn't sleep that night. I still don't know who was out there. A hunter? A hiker who got lost? Someone living off the grid? Or was it someone who had been waiting for me to fall asleep, hoping I wouldn't wake up? I'll never know. But I do know one thing. I'm never camping alone again. I never thought I'd be the type of person to get scared in the woods. I grew up hiking, fishing, and spending weekends camping in the thick forests of Oregon. It always felt like a second home to me. The smell of pine, the crunch of dirt under my boots, the way the air cooled down as the sun set. It was all familiar, comforting even. But this trip changed everything. It started as a simple solo camping trip. I had planned to spend 3 nights in the remote backcountry, far from any designated campgrounds. I wanted solitude, a break from my buzzing phone and the constant noise of city life. I parked my truck at a trailhead about 50 miles from the nearest town, shouldered my heavy pack, and started my hike in. The first day was uneventful. I followed a narrow, barely used trail for about 10 miles until I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was perfect, far enough from the main trails that I wouldn't have to worry about other people stumbling into my camp. I set up my tent, collected some firewood, and cooked a simple meal over my small camping stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire and listened to the forest come alive with night sounds. The occasional snap of a branch or rustle in the underbrush didn't bother me. I knew the woods were full of harmless creatures moving about. I slept well that night. The second day, I spent most of my time exploring the area. I followed the stream deeper into the woods, catching glimpses of deer through the trees. Around midday, I found an old, overgrown logging road. It was odd because I hadn't seen any sign of human activity since I left the trailhead. The road was barely recognizable, covered in moss and broken branches, but it was definitely man-made. Curious, I followed it for a while, but after about a mile, it just ended. No structures, no remnants of old buildings, just forest swallowing up the last traces of civilization. I turned back toward my camp, my mind wandering to thoughts of who had used this road and why it had been abandoned. That night, things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 a.m. to complete silence. Normally, the forest is never truly quiet. There's always the distant hoot of an owl, the chirp of crickets, the rustling of leaves. But at that moment, it was like the entire forest had been muted. I lay in my sleeping bag, ears straining, waiting for any sound. Then I heard it. A single footstep. Not an animal scurrying through the brush, not the wind knocking a branch loose. An unmistakable, deliberate footstep on the dry leaves outside my tent. My blood went cold. I held my breath, listening. Then another step, and another. Slow, calculated, close. I had a hunting knife in my pack, but it was buried beneath my gear. My rifle was in my truck miles away. All I had within reach was a small hatchet I used for splitting firewood. My fingers wrapped around its handle as I sat up, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could feel my own pulse in my ears, waiting, barely breathing. Then, without warning, the steps moved away, slowly at first, then faster until they faded into the distance. I sat there, gripping my hatchet, not daring to move until dawn. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. Nothing seemed out of place. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove what I had heard. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer that had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. Deer don't walk like that, and they definitely don't stop and listen outside a tent. I considered packing up and heading back to my truck, but stubbornness kept me there. I wasn't about to let some late-night paranoia ruin my trip. So, I brushed it off and went about my day. I hiked further along the stream, caught a few fish, and tried to enjoy the isolation. But that night, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I had my hatchet in my hand before I even unzipped my tent. The moment I heard the first step, I sat up, heart hammering. The footsteps were slower this time, almost like whoever or whatever it was knew I was awake. They circled my tent. Once, twice. Then they stopped. I couldn't take it anymore. In one quick motion, I unzipped the tent and lunged out, hatchet raised. But there was nothing there. My fire had burned down to embers, casting faint, flickering light, but I saw no movement. The woods were still, too still. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun was up, I packed my gear and started hiking back to my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. Every few minutes, I would stop and listen, but I never heard anything unusual. Still, the feeling never left me. When I reached my truck, I tossed my pack in the back and locked the doors the moment I climbed in. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe it was some other camper messing with me. But then I noticed something in the dirt just outside my driver's side door. A single bare footprint. Human, but wrong. The toes were long, almost claw-like, and the arch was too high. It was like something had tried to mimic a human foot but hadn't quite gotten it right. The sight of it made my stomach turn. I didn't waste another second. I started the engine and tore out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. I didn't stop until I was back on paved roads, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I haven't been camping alone since. I still love the outdoors, but that sense of peace I used to feel is gone. The woods don't feel the same anymore. Every time I step into a forest, I can't help but listen a little too closely, because I know now I'm not the only one out there. I've always loved camping. The silence of the woods, the smell of pine, the crackle of a fire. It's peaceful, a break from everything. So when I had a weekend free, I packed my gear and drove up to a remote spot in the mountains. It wasn't a popular campsite, just a clearing near a small lake, about a 5-mile hike from where I left my truck. Perfect solitude. The hike in was quiet, just the sound of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustling in the bushes. I didn't see another person the whole way, which was exactly what I wanted. I reached the lake by mid-afternoon, set up my tent near the water, and started gathering wood for a fire. The sun was warm, the air crisp, and everything felt right. By sunset, I had a good fire going. I sat back, cooked a simple meal, and let my mind settle into the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of place where you could hear every little thing, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of leaves as a breeze moved through the trees. I felt safe, at ease. Then, just after nightfall, I noticed something. The forest had gone silent. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of water lapping at the shore. Just complete stillness. I've camped enough to know that's never a good sign. The woods are never truly silent unless something is wrong. My first thought was a predator, a mountain lion maybe, or a bear. I reached for my flashlight and scanned the treeline. Nothing, just darkness between the trunks. I sat still, listening. A bead of sweat ran down my back, even though the night had turned cold. My fire popped, breaking the silence for just a second. Then I heard it, a twig snapping. It wasn't far, maybe 30, 40 feet into the trees. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam just hit more trees. Nothing moved. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe just the trees shifting in the wind. But there was no wind, and deer don't stand still when a light hits them. I stayed up a little longer listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves and turned in for the night. I zipped myself up in my sleeping bag, left my hatchet close by just in case, and closed my eyes. Then I heard footsteps, not an animal's. These were heavy, careful. Something or someone was walking just outside my tent. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped, just inches from where I lay. My mind raced. It wasn't an animal. No four-legged creature walks like that. It was a person. But why would anyone be out here? I hadn't seen a single soul all day. I stayed as still as I could. My hand gripped my hatchet. The fire outside had burned down to embers, leaving the tent in near darkness. I listened, waiting. The footsteps didn't move. Whoever it was, they were just standing there. Minutes passed, felt like hours. Then, finally, I heard the steps move again. Slowly, deliberately, circling the tent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and unzipped the tent in one quick motion. I shined the beam into the darkness. Nothing, just trees. I stepped out, turning the light in every direction. The woods were empty, no footprints in the dirt, no movement. I felt exposed standing there, so I climbed back into my tent and sat with my hatchet in hand, listening. But there were no more sounds, just the wind picking back up, rustling through the trees. After a while, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I had half-dreamed it. Maybe it was just an animal after all. The rest of the night passed without incident. The next morning, the unease lingered, but I tried to shake it off. I made coffee, packed up my gear, and decided to move campsites, just to be safe. There was another spot a mile or so away, a little deeper into the woods. It would take me further from the lake, but it also felt more secluded, which oddly made me feel safer. I hiked to the new site and set up again. The day was uneventful. I fished in a nearby stream, cooked my catch, and let the quiet settle over me. By nightfall, I had almost convinced myself that nothing weird had happened, just my nerves. Then, just as I was about to turn in, I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading from the treeline to the edge of my campfire's light. They stopped just a few feet from my tent. Someone had been watching me. Again, this time I didn't hesitate. I packed my gear in record time, slinging my backpack over my shoulder and gripping my hatchet tight. I didn't bother with my flashlight. I didn't want to make myself an easier target. I just started walking, fast. The trail was dark, the trees pressing in from both sides. I could barely see, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, my ears straining for any sound behind me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Matking mine. I started running. Branches whipped at my face. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear them, whoever they were, moving fast behind me, gaining. I pushed harder, legs screaming, until I finally saw the glint of my truck's windshield through the trees. I fumbled for my keys as I ran, nearly dropping them. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. I slammed the lock down just as something moved at the edge of the trees. A shape. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a figure standing still, watching. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there so fast I almost took out a tree. I didn't look back. I drove for miles before I finally stopped at a gas station. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I still don't know who it was. I never went back to that campsite, and I never camp alone anymore. I never liked camping. Something about sleeping in the open, exposed to whatever might be out there, never sat right with me. But my friends insisted. Just one weekend out in the woods, away from the noise and stress of city life. No phone service, no distractions, just fresh air and a campfire. I gave in. It was supposed to be simple. A 2-night trip, deep in the forest, far enough from civilization that we wouldn't see another soul. Just us and nature. We drove for hours before reaching the parking lot near the trailhead. The hike itself was long, maybe 4 or 5 miles, but the scenery was beautiful. The trees were thick, blocking most of the sunlight, leaving the ground covered in a dim green glow. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and something else. Something musky that I couldn't place. I chalked it up to the wild, maybe a distant deer or some other animal. I ignored it. By the time we reached our campsite, the sun was getting low. We set up our tents in a clearing, a small, open patch surrounded by towering trees. The others got busy gathering firewood while I unrolled my sleeping bag. Everything felt normal, just a bunch of guys preparing for a weekend outdoors. But as I stood there, looking out into the woods, I had that strange feeling, you know the one. That creeping sensation that someone is watching you. I told myself I was being paranoid. That night, we sat around the fire, telling stories, drinking cheap beer, and laughing. The air was cold but not unbearable. The fire crackled, sending orange sparks floating up into the night. The trees surrounding us stood tall and still, barely moving even with the wind. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I noticed it then, how quiet it was. No crickets, no distant rustling, no owl calls. Just silence. Felt unnatural. Then came the sound. Faint at first, like a branch breaking underfoot. I looked at the others, but they didn't seem to notice. Another snap. Closer this time. My stomach tightened. I leaned in, staring into the trees beyond the firelight. I couldn't see anything, just darkness and shadows shifting with the flickering flames. I forced a laugh, shaking off the unease. We eventually called it a night. I climbed into my tent, zipped up the entrance, and wrapped myself in my sleeping bag. I lay there listening. Still no sounds from the forest. My breathing was steady, but my heartbeat was faster than it should have been. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. Then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step. It wasn't an animal. Animals don't move like that. Another step. Closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then nothing. Just silence again. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was overthinking, that the woods play tricks on your mind. Eventually, exhaustion won. I slept. Morning came, and with it an odd feeling. I unzipped my tent and stepped out, stretching. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Not ours. Not from boots, not from sneakers. Barefoot. Human. And they weren't old. The dirt around them was still damp from the night's dew. I called the others over, pointing them out. We stood there in uneasy silence. No one wanted to admit what we were all thinking. Someone had been walking around our campsite while we slept. Someone barefoot out here in the middle of nowhere. We argued for a bit about what to do. One friend suggested it could have been some harmless hiker. Another said it was probably just our own footprints distorted by the dirt and moisture. But I knew better. These prints led from the trees to our tents. They circled us. They stopped just a few feet away from where we had been sleeping. Then they led back into the woods. We should have left then. We didn't. Instead, we spent the day trying to enjoy ourselves. Fishing, hiking, cooking over the fire. But it wasn't the same. The laughter felt forced, the conversations shorter. Every now and then, one of us would glance at the tree line, scanning for movement. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every shift in the wind, every creak of a tree made my skin crawl. The feeling of being watched was stronger than before. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke suddenly to a noise, something dragging, a slow, scraping sound just outside my tent. I stayed perfectly still, not even breathing. The dragging stopped, then a soft exhale. Not an animal, person. I wanted to call out to my friends, but fear kept me frozen. The only thing between me and whoever was out there was a thin sheet of nylon. I reached for my pocket knife, gripping it tightly. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. Morning came, and I wasn't the only one who looked exhausted. One of my friends admitted he had heard something too. Another said he thought he saw movement just beyond the trees before dawn. We decided, without much discussion, that we were done. We packed up, moving faster than we ever had before. The hike back to the car was tense. Every rustling leaf made me whip my head around. I kept expecting to see someone, something watching us from the trees, but we never saw anyone. When we finally reached the car, relief washed over me. We threw our gear into the trunk and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. As we pulled onto the road, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the trees, barefoot, watching. I never went camping again. I don't know what made me choose that spot. Maybe it was the silence or how the trees seemed to press in just right, making it feel hidden but not suffocating. I wanted to be alone, away from the noise of the world. Just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I had done this before plenty of times. I wasn't afraid of the woods, but this trip was different. I had driven out past the last gas station, down a narrow road where the pavement turned to gravel and then to dirt. The spot I found was deep in the forest, far from any trails. The kind of place where you could scream and no one would hear you. That was the appeal. I set up my tent, a simple one-person shelter, and gathered some wood for a fire. The air was cool but not cold, the kind that settles into your bones if you sit still for too long. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back listening to the night. First, it was peaceful. The crackling fire, the occasional rustle of leaves as some small animal moved through the underbrush. But then, I noticed something, a sound, faint at first just beyond the edge of my hearing. A rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sound was steady, even, not the erratic movement of an animal sniffing around. It was the sound of someone walking. I turned my head slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the glow of the fire. Nothing, just trees, their trunks stretching up into the night like silent sentinels. The sound stopped. I tried to shake it off, but something felt off. It was too quiet. The normal sounds of the forest, the insects, the distant calls of birds had stopped. I listened, my body tense, waiting for something to break the silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just my breathing, the crackling fire, and the distant wind shifting through the trees. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I still felt it, that feeling of being watched. I decided to call it a night, even though I knew I wouldn't sleep well. I put out the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. The thin nylon felt like a flimsy barrier between me and whatever was out there. I lay there listening, and then I heard it again, closer this time. The same slow, deliberate steps, not rushing, not hesitant, just moving, closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. Then nothing. I waited, barely breathing. Minutes stretched on. I told myself that maybe I had imagined it, that my mind was turning normal forest sounds into something sinister. But I didn't believe that. I reached for the knife I always kept in my pack. My fingers closed around the handle, gripping it tightly. I listened. Still nothing. Just silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that, lying still, every muscle tensed, waiting for something to happen. And then, finally, the sounds of the forest returned. Cricket chirped. A distant owl called. Whatever had been outside my tent was gone. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, gripping my knife, waiting for the sun. When morning came, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more normal. But as I looked around, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, human footprints, circling my tent. I packed up and left without eating, without even taking a second to enjoy the morning air. I moved fast, keeping my knife in my hand as I walked back to my car. I never camped alone again. It's supposed to be a weekend escape, a quiet retreat to clear my head, breathe some fresh air, and step away from the endless notifications and buzzing of the city. I found the cabin online, simple, remote, perfect. The ad promised solitude and peace. What more could I ask for? The drive up took longer than I expected. Twisting mountain roads, some barely wide enough for one car, led me deeper into the forest. Cell service disappeared hours ago, but I told myself that's part of the charm. No emails, no calls, no distractions. Just me and the woods. The cabin sits in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that stretch endlessly in every direction. It's old but well kept. A slanted roof, dark wooden walls, and a wraparound porch. Quaint, almost too perfect, like something out of a brochure. Inside, it's cozy. There's a stone fireplace in the corner, a worn leather couch, and a small kitchen with an old gas stove. The floors creak with every step, but it's the kind of creak that feels lived in, not eerie. A single bedroom and a tiny bathroom complete the layout. Simple, functional, exactly what I wanted. By the time I unpack and settle in, it's late afternoon. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows through the trees. I make a cup of coffee and sit on the porch, watching the light filter through the branches. It's quiet, so quiet it almost feels unnatural. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tell myself I'll get used to it. Night falls quickly out here. One moment the sky is painted in soft hues of orange and pink. The next, it's pitch black. I hadn't realized how dark it would get. No streetlights, no neighboring houses with porch lights left on. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. I light a fire in the fireplace and sit on the couch, reading a dog-eared paperback I found on the bookshelf. The flames crackle softly, the only sound in the cabin. Occasionally, I hear something outside. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, but I chalk it up to wildlife. Deer maybe, or a raccoon. Around midnight, I decide to call it a night. The bedroom is cold, and the bed is harder than I'd like, but exhaustion wins out. I fall asleep almost instantly. I wake up to a noise, a soft thud, somewhere outside. My eyes snap open, and for a moment, I'm disoriented. The room is pitch black. I listen, holding my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I tell myself it was probably a pine cone falling from a tree, or maybe an animal knocking over something on the porch. Still, I can't shake the feeling that something's off. I get out of bed and peek through the curtain. The clearing is bathed in pale moonlight. The trees stand like silent sentinels around the cabin. Everything looks normal. I'm about to go back to bed when I notice it. A shadow at the edge of the tree line. It's hard to tell what it is. Could be anything. A tree stump, a trick of the light. But it's not there when I look again. I lock the door before going back to bed. The next morning, the sun is shining, and everything feels less sinister. I laugh at myself for being so jumpy. The forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. I spend the day exploring the surrounding area. There's a small trail that leads deeper into the woods. The air is crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Birds flit between the trees, their calls echoing through the forest. It's peaceful, exactly what I came here for. By the time I return to the cabin, the sun is beginning to set. I'm tired but satisfied. I make a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, and settle in for another quiet night. But the feeling of unease returns as soon as darkness falls. I'm sitting on the couch, staring into the fire, when I hear it again. A soft thud, followed by the creak of wood. This time, it's unmistakable. It's coming from the porch. I freeze, heart pounding. For a moment, I consider ignoring it, pretending I didn't hear anything. But curiosity gets the better of me. I grab the flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly make my way to the door. The porch is empty. The beam of the flashlight sweeps across the clearing, illuminating the trees at the edge of the yard. Nothing moves. No sign of anyone or anything. I'm about to turn back inside when I notice something on the porch floor. A footprint. Barefoot, human. It's smeared slightly, like whoever left it was in a hurry. I feel a chill run down my spine. I scan the tree line again, my pulse hammering in my ears. Still nothing. I lock the door and wedge a chair under the handle for good measure. Sleep doesn't come easily. Every creak, every rustle outside has me on edge. I lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, exhaustion takes over and I drift off. I wake up to a sound that makes my blood run cold. It's the unmistakable creak of the floorboards inside the cabin. I'm not alone. My heart is in my throat. I lie perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound is faint but deliberate. Slow, measured steps, moving from the living room toward the bedroom. I can't breathe. My mind races, trying to make sense of it. Did I forget to lock the door? No, I remember locking it. The chair, it's still under the handle. No one could have gotten in, unless they were already inside. The footsteps stop just outside the bedroom door. For a moment, everything is silent. Then the door handle rattles softly at first, then more forcefully. I've never felt fear like this before. It's primal, all-consuming. I don't think. I act. I grab my phone from the nightstand and turn on the flashlight. The beam cuts through the darkness, illuminating the bedroom door. The handle is still. The footsteps are gone. I don't waste a second. I throw on my boots, grab my keys, and bolt for the front door. I don't care what's out there. Whatever it is, it's better than what's inside. The night air is freezing, biting against my skin. I sprint to my car, jump in, and lock the doors. The engine roars to life, and I peel out of the clearing, tires kicking up dirt and gravel. I don't look back. It's only when I'm miles away, back on the main road, that I finally start to breathe again. My hands are shaking. My heart feels like it's gonna burst out of my chest. I drive straight through the night, not stopping until I'm back in the city. The cabin, the woods, the footsteps, they all feel like a bad dream. Something that couldn't possibly be real, but it was real. The next day, I call the rental company. I tell them what happened, every detail. The woman on the other end listens patiently, then pauses before responding. "That's strange," she says. "We haven't rented that cabin out in months." I hang up without saying another word. I never go back. Hiking had always been my escape. I wasn't an experienced mountaineer or a hardcore survivalist. I was just an average guy who liked getting away from the noise and chaos of life every now and then. I enjoyed the solitude, the fresh air, and the rhythm of my boots crunching dirt. Usually, I stuck to well-marked trails, but that day, I decided to push a bit farther. I don't know if it was curiosity, boredom, or just bad luck that made me veer off course. But I can tell you one thing. If I could go back, I wouldn't have taken that turn. It was late autumn, and the forest was nearly silent, except for the occasional gust of wind shaking dry leaves loose from the branches. The trail I was on was part of a loop I'd done once before, but this time, I noticed a faint side path I hadn't seen before. It wasn't marked, but it was well-trodden enough to make me think others had walked it recently. I figured it might be a shortcut or lead to a good lookout point, so I took it. The first few minutes felt normal. The path was narrow, winding through dense trees that blocked out most of the afternoon light. My footsteps echoed faintly, but otherwise, everything was eerily quiet. There were no birds, no rustling squirrels, nothing. Just the sound of my breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I pressed on, figuring I'd hit a clearing or loop back to the main trail soon enough. After all, how far could it really go? But the deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The path began to slope upward, steeper and steeper, until I found myself climbing what seemed like an endless ridge. My legs started to burn, and my breathing grew heavy. Still, I kept going, thinking there had to be a payoff at the top. A view, maybe, or a chance to reorient myself. But when I finally reached the top, there was no view. No open sky, no sweeping landscape. Just more trees, dense and dark, pressing in from all sides. The ridge flattened out briefly before sloping down again, and I realized I hadn't found a summit. I was on some kind of narrow, forested spine running across the landscape like a scar. I checked my phone for a map, but there was no signal. No big deal, I thought.
Backtrack.
Except when I turned around, the trail was gone. I swear I'd followed a clear path all the way up, but now there was nothing but leaf-strewn ground and tangled roots. No footprints, no worn dirt, no sign anyone had ever walked here. I spun in a slow circle, trying to find any hint of the way I'd come. Nothing. My chest tightened as panic started to creep in. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't lost, not really. I just needed to head downhill. Gravity always leads back to lower ground, and lower ground usually means water or a trail. So, I started walking again, picking my way down the slope. The problem was, the ridge didn't want to let me go. Every time I thought I was heading downhill, I'd find myself climbing again. The ground seemed to shift under my feet, subtly steering me back upward. I tried to focus, to keep my bearings, but after a while, everything looked the same. The trees were all tall and bare, their thin branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air felt heavy, almost claustrophobic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped to catch my breath and listened. Still no birds, no wind, no distant hum of cars or voices, just silence. I told myself I was imagining things. I'd heard of people getting disoriented in the woods, especially when they were tired. Maybe I'd been walking in circles without realizing it. But as the sun dipped lower, turning the sky a murky gray, the shadows deepened, and that nagging sense of wrongness only grew stronger. I picked up my pace, half jogging down the slope, determined to put as much distance as I could between myself and that cursed ridge. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tripped on a root and nearly face-planted, barely catching myself on a tree trunk. And that's when I saw it. A cabin. It sat in a small clearing, its roof sagging, its windows dark and empty. The wood was weathered and gray, moss creeping up its sides like veins. It looked abandoned, but at that moment I didn't care. Shelter was shelter. I limped toward it, praying it wasn't locked. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of rot and mildew. A broken chair lay on its side near a cold, soot-filled fireplace. The floor was littered with leaves and debris, but it was dry, and that was enough for me. I sat down against the wall, trying to calm my racing heart. I'd wait until morning, I decided. The dark was closing in fast, and wandering around at night was a death sentence. I pulled out my water bottle and took a sip, trying to ignore the gnawing hunger in my gut. I hadn't packed much, just some granola bars and trail mix, but I'd eaten most of it earlier, thinking I'd be back at my car by sunset. The hours dragged by. I kept glancing at my watch, but time seemed to move slower than it should have. Every creak of the old cabin made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the wind or the wood settling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a start to complete darkness. My phone's battery had died, and without it, the cabin was pitch black. I strained my ears, listening. The silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside. Footsteps. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The steps were slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart thundered in my chest as I tried to convince myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. The steps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, my body rigid with fear. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, without warning, the door creaked open a few inches. I bolted. I don't remember much about that night, just flashes of trees whipping past me as I ran, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Somehow, I made it off that ridge and found myself stumbling onto a gravel road. A passing truck screeched to a stop, and the driver, an older man with a kind face, helped me into the cab. I was too shaken to explain what had happened, and he didn't ask many questions. He drove me to the nearest town where I finally called for help. Later, when I tried to retrace my steps, I couldn't find the ridge or the cabin. Search teams combed the area but found nothing. No trail, no ridge, no sign of a cabin. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've read about hikers getting lost, experiencing strange phenomena in the woods, but nothing comes close to what I felt up there. I haven't been hiking since, and I never will again. It started as a simple weekend trip, a solo hike to clear my head and escape the noise of life for a while. I'd planned everything carefully, packed my gear, checked the forecast, mapped out my route. Nothing crazy, just a 2-day loop through a remote stretch of forest that promised stunning views and quiet trails. I'd been on plenty of hikes before, so I wasn't worried. If anything, I was looking forward to the peace. I parked my car at the trailhead around 7:30 a.m. The sky was pale blue, just lightening up with the first hints of sun. The air was crisp but not cold, that perfect balance that makes you feel awake and alive. My pack felt a little heavier than usual, but I chalked it up to bringing a few extra supplies, just in case. Water, snacks, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, my trusty knife, and a small first aid kit. Everything I thought I might need for a solo trip like this. The trail started easy, soft dirt underfoot, trees spaced wide apart with golden light filtering through the leaves. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches filled the air. I walked steadily, not rushing, just taking it all in. About an hour in, the trail began to climb. Nothing too steep, but enough to get my heart rate up and make me aware of how much I'd been neglecting cardio lately. I stopped for a quick break, sipping water and catching my breath. A small clearing offered a glimpse of the valley below, thick with evergreens and shrouded in light morning mist. I felt good, strong, alive. I pressed on, the trail winding higher, the trees growing denser. The air cooled as I climbed, and shadows stretched longer across the ground. I noticed how quiet it had gotten. The birdsong had faded, replaced by the occasional creak of tree limbs and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. By noon, I'd reached the ridge, a narrow stretch of rocky terrain with steep drop-offs on either side. The wind picked up here, cooler and sharper than it had been below. I stopped again to take in the view. The world stretched out before me. Rolling hills, endless forest, and distant peaks that seemed to touch the sky. It was breathtaking, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. All the stress, all the noise of life, just gone. I snapped a few photos, then checked my map. The trail curved along the ridge for a couple of miles before descending back into the forest. My plan was to make camp in a small clearing marked on the map, about 6 miles ahead. I'd be there well before dark, or so I thought. I don't know exactly when things started to go wrong. Maybe it was when I took that short detour off the main trail to get a better look at the view. Or maybe it was when I stopped paying attention to the markers, too caught up in the beauty around me. Either way, it happened fast. 1 minute I was on the trail, sure of my direction. The next, I was standing in the middle of the woods, surrounded by trees that all looked the same, with no sign of the path. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground for any hint of the trail footprints, disturbed leaves, anything. Nothing. Okay, I told myself. Don't panic. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to get my bearings. According to the map, the trail should have been just a few yards to my left. But when I walked in that direction, there was no trail, just more trees. I backtracked, or at least I thought I did. But everything looked different now, unfamiliar. The sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows that made the forest feel darker, more enclosed. I tried to stay calm, but a knot of unease tightened in my chest. I'd been off the trail for maybe 10 minutes, but already it felt like longer, much longer. I kept moving, trying to stay in a straight line. The forest was thicker here, the undergrowth tangling around my ankles. Branches clawed at my arms, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. I glanced at my watch. 3:15 p.m. Still plenty of daylight left, but the sinking sun reminded me that time was not on my side. I needed to find the trail, and soon. The ground began to slope downward, steeper with each step. Loose rocks and fallen leaves made footing tricky, and I slipped more than once, catching myself on nearby trees. The air was cooler now, damp with the scent of earth and moss. A sharp snap echoed through the trees, a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I froze, heart pounding. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a squirrel. But the sound had been louder than I expected, and it left an unsettling silence in its wake. I picked up my pace, moving downhill. If I could find the valley floor, I might be able to reorient myself. Rivers usually ran through valleys, and rivers often led to trails or roads. At least that was the logic I clung to. By the time I reached the bottom of the slope, the light was fading fast. The forest floor was soft and spongy, covered in thick moss that muffled my footsteps. The trees loomed taller here, their branches weaving a dense canopy that blocked out what little light remained. I kept moving, scanning the ground for any sign of a trail, a footprint, a broken branch, anything. But the forest felt untouched, wild in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I paused to catch my breath, trying to calm the rising panic. My mouth was dry, and my water bottle was nearly empty. I took a small sip, saving the rest. Then I heard it again, a snap, closer this time. I spun around, eyes searching the shadows. Nothing, just trees and darkness. "Calm down," I whispered. "You're imagining things." But deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something or someone was out there. The first time I heard about the trail was during a conversation with some coworkers. It was supposed to be one of the most isolated hiking spots in the region. Miles of untouched wilderness with no crowds, no noise, just pure solitude. That's exactly what I needed. Life had been suffocating lately, and I was desperate for an escape. I wanted to lose myself in nature, away from the constant hum of emails, deadlines, and traffic. The trail wasn't on any of the popular hiking apps, but after some digging online, I found a few scattered posts about it. Just vague directions and warnings to be prepared. It wasn't maintained, which meant no markers, no clear path, and definitely no cell service. Perfect. I packed my gear. A sturdy pair of hiking boots, a loaded backpack with food, water, a map, compass, and a first aid kit. I was ready for some peace and quiet. I drove out early on a Saturday morning. The sun was just starting to rise, casting a soft, golden light over the mountains. The parking area was little more than a dirt clearing off a back road, surrounded by towering pines. There were no other cars. That didn't surprise me. This wasn't the kind of place that attracted casual hikers. I double-checked my gear, locked my car, and set off. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine needles and damp earth filled my lungs. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding through dense forest. Birds chirped overhead, and the sound of a nearby creek followed me for a while. By noon, I was deep into the woods, far beyond the reach of civilization. I hadn't seen another soul all day. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, just me and the wilderness. I found a flat rock near a small stream and stopped for lunch, enjoying the sound of water trickling over stones. After eating, I checked my map. The trail looped around a ridge, leading to a viewpoint before circling back toward the parking area. It was supposed to be about a 10-mile hike in total. Easy enough. I figured I'd be back at my car by late afternoon. I pushed on. The trail grew steeper and less defined as I climbed the ridge. The trees thinned out, replaced by rocky outcroppings and low shrubs. The sun hung high overhead, the heat pressing down on me. Sweat trickled down my back, and I stopped occasionally to catch my breath and sip water. The view from the top was worth the effort. The forest stretched out below me in every direction, a sea of green rolling toward distant mountains. I stood there for a while, taking it all in. This was why I loved hiking, the sense of freedom, the feeling of being so small in such a vast world. But the moment didn't last long. A sudden gust of wind brought a chill, and I glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, moving fast. A storm was coming. I needed to get moving. I started down the other side of the ridge, picking up my pace. The trail was even less defined here, little more than a faint path through the underbrush. I kept my eyes on the ground, careful not to lose it. The wind picked up, rustling the trees around me. The first drops of rain splattered on the dirt. Then the trail disappeared. One moment I was on it, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, trying to find it again. Nothing, just trees and rocks and thick undergrowth. I pulled out my map and compass, trying to orient myself. I must have veered off course at some point, but I wasn't sure where. The rain started coming down harder, soaking through my clothes. I tried to retrace my steps, but the ground was already turning to mud, and everything looked the same. Panic bubbled up in my chest, but I forced it down. I've been hiking for years. I knew how to handle this. Stay calm. Think. I checked my map again. If I kept heading west, I'd eventually hit a logging road that ran parallel to the trail. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way out. I set off in what I hoped was the right direction, pushing through the underbrush. Branches snagged at my clothes, and the rain stung my face. My boots squelched with every step. Time lost all meaning. The forest closed in around me, endless and unchanging. I kept walking, my eyes flicking between my compass and the ground. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of what looked like a trail, only to lose it again moments later. My breathing grew ragged, and my legs ached. Then I saw it, a shape through the trees. At first, I thought it was a cabin, but as I got closer, I realized it was an old, abandoned hunting shack. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging in places. One of the windows was broken, the glass long gone. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. I hesitated for a moment, then made my way inside. The door creaked on rusty hinges, and the smell of damp wood and decay hit me. The interior was small and dark, with a single room and a dirt floor. An old metal stove sat in one corner, and a pile of rotting firewood lay next to it. There was a table and a couple of chairs, both covered in a thick layer of dust. I dropped my pack and sank into one of the chairs, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The rain hammered on the roof, but at least I was out of it. I pulled out my phone, even though I knew there wouldn't be any service. No signal, of course. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. I needed to rest just for a little while. Then I'd figure out my next move. A sound jolted me awake. It was faint, barely audible over the rain, but it was there. A soft thud, like footsteps on the dirt floor. My heart leapt into my throat, and I sat up, straining to hear. Nothing, just the rain and the wind. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a possum maybe, but the feeling of unease lingered. I glanced around the shack, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The door was still closed, and there was no sign of anything unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood, my muscles protesting, and grabbed my pack. I wasn't going to spend the night here. I'd rather be out in the rain than trapped in this place. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold rain washing over me. The forest was dark and silent, the trees looming like shadows. I checked my compass again and set off, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't care about finding the road anymore. I just wanted to get away from the shack. But the forest didn't want to let me go. No matter which way I turned, it all looked the same. The trees pressed in around me, their branches clawing at my skin. The ground was a treacherous mess of mud and roots, and I stumbled more than once, barely catching myself before I fell. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and the sky darkened. Night was coming. I needed to find shelter again, but the thought of another shack, another dark, enclosed space, made my skin crawl. I kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and stubborn determination. My flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted shapes of trees and rocks. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs felt like lead. Then, finally, I saw it, the faint outline of a road through the trees. Relief flooded through me, and I stumbled toward it, nearly collapsing when my boots hit the gravel. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, then started walking. The road was rough and overgrown, but it was a road. It had to lead somewhere. I followed it for what felt like hours, my steps slow and unsteady. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with mist, and the cold seeped into my bones. Eventually, I saw headlights in the distance. A truck rumbled toward me, its engine a low growl in the stillness. I waved my arms, relief washing over me as it slowed to a stop. The driver was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He rolled down the window, taking in my mud-splattered clothes and exhausted expression. "You all right, son?" he asked. I nodded, too tired to speak. He gestured for me to get in, and I climbed into the passenger seat, sinking into the worn leather. "You're lucky I came by," he said as he started driving. "Not many people use this road anymore." I nodded again, my eyes drifting closed. The warmth of the truck's heater and the hum of the engine lulled me into a half-sleep. I didn't know where the road would take me, but it didn't matter. I was safe. For now, that was enough. started out like any other weekend adventure. I wanted to get away for a while, away from the noise and the constant hum of daily life. Hiking had always been my escape, a way to disconnect from everything and just breathe for a while. I packed light, a small backpack with water, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and an extra jacket. It wasn't supposed to be anything crazy, just a day hike through a less traveled trail deep in the mountains. I'd done longer hikes before. This one seemed easy compared to those. The trail wasn't marked well, but I had a map and a pretty good sense of direction. I parked my car at the trailhead, tucked away from the main road, and set off around 8 a.m. The morning air was crisp, cool, and refreshing. The sun hung low in the sky, casting soft light through the tall pines that lined the trail. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how quiet everything seemed. The first few hours were uneventful. I followed the path, winding my way deeper into the woods. There were no signs of other hikers, which didn't surprise me. This trail wasn't exactly popular. That's part of why I chose it. I liked the solitude, the feeling of being out there on my own. The forest grew thicker as I went further in, the trees standing closer together, their branches stretching overhead to form a dense canopy. The sunlight filtered through in patches, creating a shifting pattern of light and shadow on the ground. I kept walking, my boots crunching softly on the dirt path. It must have been around noon when I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been clear and easy to follow, suddenly seemed less defined. The dirt path narrowed, and the brush on either side grew thicker, encroaching on the trail. At first, I thought it was just a part of the trail that wasn't maintained well. No big deal, I thought. I pushed through and it would open back up soon. But it didn't. Instead, the trail seemed to vanish completely. I stopped and looked around, trying to figure out where it had gone. There were no markers, no signs, nothing to indicate where I was supposed to go. Just trees and undergrowth in every direction. I pulled out my map, but it didn't help much. I knew roughly where I was, but the map didn't show any detail of this particular area. I decided to backtrack a bit, figuring I must have missed a turn somewhere. I retraced my steps for what felt like an hour, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all looked the same, and the more I walked, the more disoriented I felt. My heart rate picked up a bit, but I told myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. The sun was still high in the sky, and I wasn't too worried yet. I had enough supplies to last me the day, maybe longer if I rationed them. Worst case, I'd find a clearing and wait until I could get my bearings again. I kept moving, trying to stay in a straight line, hoping I'd eventually hit the main trail again. But the deeper I went, the more unfamiliar everything seemed. The forest grew darker, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. The air felt heavier, cooler. Then I heard it, a sound that stopped me in my tracks. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling in the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a squirrel or a bird, nothing unusual. But then it happened again, closer this time. The brush stirred, and I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. It wasn't a squirrel. I stood completely still, my heart thudding in my chest. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything. Whatever it was staying just out of sight. I waited, listening. The sound came again, circling to my left, then behind me. I turned slowly, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. Still nothing. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding strange and hollow in the quiet forest. No response. I kept walking, picking up my pace a little. I wasn't scared yet, but I was definitely on edge. Every step seemed to echo, the sound of my boots crunching on the forest floor louder than it should have been. Then I saw it, a shape moving between the trees up ahead. It was fast, just a blur of motion, but definitely human-sized. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, watching the spot where I'd seen it. Nothing. I told myself it was probably another hiker, someone else who had gotten off the trail like I had. Maybe they'd heard me and were trying to find me. That made sense, didn't it? "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Cold knot formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I kept moving, my eyes darting from tree to tree, my senses on high alert. The forest felt different now, less peaceful, more oppressive. The air seemed colder, the shadows darker. I walked for what felt like hours, the tension in my chest growing with each step. I kept expecting to see that shape again, but it never reappeared. The only sound was the crunch of my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves. And then, just as suddenly as it had vanished, the trail reappeared. Relief flooded through me. I stepped onto the path, my shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like forever. I didn't care where the trail led at this point. I just wanted to follow it until I found my way back. I walked quickly, almost jogging, the tension slowly draining away. The sun was starting to set now, the sky tinged with orange and pink. I wanted to be out of the woods before dark. But then I noticed something strange. The trail didn't look right. The ground was covered in thick moss, and the trees lining the path were older, their trunks twisted and gnarled. It didn't feel like the same trail I had started on. I kept walking, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar. But the further I went, the weirder it got. My heart sank as I realized the truth. This wasn't the same trail. I had no idea where I was. I stopped, trying to decide what to do. The logical part of my brain told me to stay put, conserve my energy, and wait until morning. But another part of me, the part that was still spooked from whatever had been following me earlier, didn't want to stay in one place for too long. So I kept walking. The light was fading fast now, the forest growing darker with each passing minute. My flashlight cast a narrow beam of light ahead of me, illuminating the twisted trees and the thick undergrowth. And then I heard it again, that same soft rustling sound. It was closer this time, almost right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the trees. Nothing. My pulse was racing now, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep moving. The sound followed me, staying just out of sight. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. I started to run, my boots pounding against the ground, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run anymore, I burst into a clearing. I stopped, gasping for breath, my eyes scanning the open space. The sky was dark now, the stars just starting to appear. The clearing was surrounded by trees, their dark shapes looming like silent giants. I stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I sank to the ground, my heart still racing. I didn't know how long I sat there, but eventually, my breathing slowed and my pulse returned to something close to normal. I was safe for now. The rest of the night passed slowly. I didn't sleep, couldn't. I sat in the clearing, my flashlight clutched in one hand, my back against a tree. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a fresh wave of fear through me. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a surge of relief. I stood, my legs stiff and sore, and started walking again. Took me most of the morning, but eventually, I found the main trail again. This time, I didn't let it out of my sight. I followed it all the way back to the trailhead, my heart lifting as I saw my car parked where I'd left it. I climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, letting the relief wash over me. I don't know what was out there in those woods. Maybe it was just my imagination, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was something else, something I don't want to think about. All I know is that I'll never hike alone again. The air was crisp that morning, the kind that stings your face just enough to make you feel alive. I pulled on my jacket, adjusted the straps on my pack, and double-checked my supplies. Water, trail snacks, a compass, a map, and a small first aid kit. Everything I needed for a solo hike into the backcountry. I planned this trip for weeks. It wasn't my first solo hike, but it was the longest one I'd attempted yet. A 14-mile loop through dense forest, up a ridge, and back down into the valley. I'd read about the trail in an online forum. Remote, lightly trafficked, challenging enough to be interesting, but not overly technical. Sounded perfect. The sun hadn't fully risen when I hit the trailhead. The woods were still wrapped in shadows, with only faint streaks of light filtering through the branches. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. My boots crunched softly on the packed dirt as I moved steadily uphill, my breath visible in the chilly air. I liked this early part of the hike, where everything still felt fresh and full of promise. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick stands of spruce and fir. It was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I settled into a rhythm, my thoughts drifting as my legs carried me forward. There's something about hiking alone that's hard to explain unless you've done it. It's not loneliness. It's more like a deep, calming silence that wraps around you. Your senses heighten. You notice the way the sunlight dances on the leaves, the smell of the moss, the sound of your own footsteps. By mid-morning, I'd reached a section of the trail that skirted the edge of a steep ravine. The drop-off wasn't sheer, but it was steep enough to make you watch your step. I paused to take a drink from my water bottle and looked out over the valley below. The view was stunning. The trees stretched out in every direction, a sea of green broken only by a silver ribbon of river far below. I took a few photos, then pressed on. The trail grew narrower and rougher as it climbed higher, the ground littered with loose rocks and fallen branches. I had to concentrate on where I placed my feet, especially in the trickier sections. My breathing grew heavier, my legs starting to burn from the effort. A couple of hours later, I reached the top of the ridge. I stood there for a while, catching my breath and taking in the view. The wind was stronger up here, colder too. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and checked the map. According to the trail description, the path would drop down the other side of the ridge and follow a creek back to the trailhead. It should have been an easy descent, but that's where things started to go wrong. The trail on the other side of the ridge was harder to follow. It was overgrown in places, the path almost disappearing into the underbrush. I slowed down, scanning the ground for signs of where it continued. Every so often, I'd spot a faint trail marker, an old piece of ribbon tied to a tree or a blaze painted on a rock, but it wasn't consistent. About an hour into the descent, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in a while. The trail had petered out into nothing more than a game trail, barely a foot wide and choked with brush. I stopped, trying to get my bearings. I pulled out the map and compass, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. According to the map, the trail should have been veering to the right, following the contour of the ridge, but the path I was on seemed to be heading straight down the slope. I debated turning back, but I hated the idea of retracing my steps all the way to the top of the ridge. Besides, I told myself I could always cut back to the right and find the trail again. I pressed on, bushwhacking through the underbrush. The ground grew steeper, the footing more treacherous. Loose rocks and fallen leaves made it slippery, and I had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from sliding. My heart rate quickened, not from exertion, but from the gnawing sense that I was getting deeper and deeper into a situation I couldn't easily back out of. Then I slipped. 1 second, I was carefully picking my way down the slope. The next, my foot hit a patch of wet leaves, and I was sliding uncontrollably. I tried to grab a branch, but it snapped off in my hand. My pack pulled me backward, throwing me off balance. I hit the ground hard and kept sliding, the world tilting and spinning around me. When I finally came to a stop, I was lying on my back in a tangle of ferns and dead leaves. My head was spinning, and my right ankle throbbed with pain. I sat up slowly, wincing as I moved. I tried to put weight on my right foot, but a sharp, stabbing pain shot up my leg. "Shit," I muttered. I sat there for a few minutes trying to think. I was off the trail with a twisted, or maybe broken, ankle miles from the nearest road. I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but there was nothing, not even a single bar. I knew I couldn't just sit there. I needed to move to find the trail again. I used a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch and hobbled forward, each step sending a jolt of pain through my leg. My progress was agonizingly slow. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I could feel the temperature dropping. Panic gnawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to stay calm, think clearly. I kept moving, scanning the ground for any sign of the trail. After what felt like an eternity, I stumbled across a dry creek bed. It wasn't the trail, but it was something, a landmark I could follow. Creeks usually led downhill, and downhill usually meant civilization eventually. I decided to follow it. The creek bed was rough, full of loose rocks and fallen branches, but at least it was easier to follow than the bushwhacking I'd been doing. I hobbled along as fast as I could, the pain in my ankle growing worse with every step. The light was fading fast now, the shadows deepening into darkness. I knew I needed to find shelter before night fell completely. Hypothermia was a real risk out here, especially with the temperature dropping and my body already battered and exhausted. I found a small overhang in the side of a hill, a shallow cave, barely big enough for me to crawl into. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I gathered some dry leaves and pine needles to use as insulation, wrapping myself in my jacket and trying to conserve body heat. The night was long and cold. Every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. The rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a branch. I told myself it was just the wind, just the normal sounds of the forest at night. But it didn't stop the prickling fear that something or someone was out there watching. I barely slept. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I forced myself to move. My ankle was swollen and bruised, but the rest had helped a little. I limped back to the creek bed and kept following it, driven by the desperate hope that it would lead me to safety. By mid-morning, I heard the sound of rushing water, real water, not the dry creek bed I'd been following. I pushed through the underbrush and found myself standing on the banks of a wide, fast-moving river. Relief washed over me. I followed the river downstream, sticking as close to the water as I could. The terrain was still rough, but the river was a lifeline, a thread that connected me to the outside world. Hours later, I stumbled out onto a dirt road. I almost cried when I saw it. It wasn't much, just a narrow, rutted track, but it was a sign of civilization. I leaned on my makeshift crutch and started hobbling down the road, hoping it would lead me to help. About a mile down the road, I heard the sound of an engine. A beat-up pickup truck came around the bend, and I waved frantically, almost collapsing with relief when it pulled over. The driver was an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. He took one look at me and said, "You look like hell." I laughed, a dry, cracked sound that was more like a sob, and climbed into the truck. As we drove down the winding road, the weight of the past 24 hours finally hit me. I was exhausted, battered, and bruised, but I was alive. I'd made it, and I knew one thing for sure: I'd never take another solo hike for granted again. The trailhead was quiet when I pulled up. It always is early in the morning. The sun hadn't fully broken through the trees yet, and the chill in the air made me zip my jacket all the way up. My plan was simple: hike up to the summit, spend some time there soaking in the views, and get back down before the late afternoon. It wasn't supposed to be a difficult trail, about 8 miles round trip with some steady climbs but nothing extreme. I had done similar hikes before without any trouble. I had my pack loaded with the basics: water, snacks, first aid kit, a lightweight jacket, and a map of the area. Even though I had a GPS app on my phone, I always liked having a paper map as backup. You can't rely on signal out in the mountains. The first mile or so was peaceful. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird call. I could smell the damp earth and pine needles around me. Sunlight started to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the trail. Everything felt calm, almost too calm, but I brushed that thought away. By mile 2, the trail got steeper and my breathing grew heavier. I stopped for a moment, hands on my knees, and took a swig of water. As I caught my breath, I noticed how quiet it had become, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of my breathing and the distant rustling of leaves. I kept moving, trying not to think too much about it. It's easy to let your mind wander when you're alone out in the woods, and the last thing I wanted was to psych myself out over nothing. Around mile 3, I reached a fork in the trail. According to the map, both paths would eventually lead to the summit, but one was a bit longer and less steep. I figured I'd take the shorter, steeper route up and save the longer path for the way back. As I started up the steeper trail, the terrain changed. The dirt path became narrower, and the trees grew closer together. Roots snaked across the ground, forcing me to watch every step. It felt more isolated here, like the trail hadn't been used in a while. About 20 minutes later, I noticed something odd. A pair of old hiking poles lying just off the trail. They looked weathered, the grips worn down and rust starting to creep up the metal. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone nearby, but there was no one. I debated picking them up, but decided to leave them. People lose things all the time on hikes. No big deal. Still, it nagged at me as I kept moving. Who leaves hiking poles behind? They're pretty essential on rough terrain. I tried to push the thought out of my head and focus on the trail ahead, but that uneasy feeling started to grow. The trail got steeper and rockier. My legs burned with each step, but I kept pushing, determined to reach the summit. I'd earned that view. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. A torn, weather-beaten backpack lying half-buried in the dirt. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe even longer. The fabric was faded, and the straps were frayed. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. My heart started pounding in my chest, louder than before. It wasn't like finding a lost water bottle or a single glove. A whole backpack? That was different. I crouched down and carefully unzipped it. Inside, I found a few items: an old water bottle, a trail map, and a crushed granola bar. The map looked similar to mine, but it was torn in places and stained with something dark. My stomach tightened. I glanced around again, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone had ditched the backpack after getting lost or injured. Or maybe they left it behind when they decided the trail was too tough. That made sense, right? Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. I stood up and kept moving, picking up my pace. The summit wasn't far now, another mile, maybe less. I figured I'd get there, take a quick break, and head back down the longer trail. I just needed to keep moving and not let my imagination run wild. The trees thinned out as I neared the top, and the trail leveled off. The view was stunning, mountain peaks stretching out in every direction. The valley below bathed in soft morning light, but I barely noticed it. I couldn't stop thinking about the backpack and the hiking poles. I forced myself to sit down and take a few deep breaths. The air was crisp and cool, and I could feel my heart rate slowly returning to normal. Maybe I was overreacting. It's easy to get spooked when you're alone in the woods. After a few minutes, I decided it was time to head back. I took the longer trail just like I'd planned. It felt safer somehow, wider, more open. But as I made my way down, that uneasy feeling returned. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but there was never anything there, just the trees and the shadows. Then I saw it again, another torn backpack just off the trail. This one looked even worse than the first, like it had been there for years. The fabric was shredded, and the frame was bent and rusted. My hands started to shake as I stepped closer. That's when I noticed the shoe sticking out from beneath the pack. It was old and weathered, almost blending in with the dirt and leaves. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no denying it. Someone had been here, and they hadn't left. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and checked for signal. Nothing. No bars, no service. My hands trembled as I stuffed the phone back in my pocket and turned to head back down the trail as fast as I could without running. Every sound around me felt amplified. The crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that someone or something was following me. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't stop, didn't dare slow down until I finally saw the trailhead in the distance. When I reached my car, I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors. My heart was still racing as I started the engine and pulled out of the lot. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about the backpacks and the shoe. Who had they belonged to? What had happened to them? I never found out. A week later, I called the local ranger station and reported what I'd seen. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything back. To this day, I can't hike without thinking about that trail, about how quickly a peaceful walk in the woods can turn into something else entirely. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the forest ever gave up its secrets, or if they're still out there, hidden beneath the leaves and shadows, waiting to be found. Hiking had always been my escape. Something about walking deep into the wilderness, leaving behind cell signals and paved roads, felt like hitting a reset button. It's peaceful most of the time, quiet except for the crunch of boots on dirt, wind weaving through the trees, and birds calling from the canopy. But every now and then, that peace tips into something else. Something you can't quite name until it's too late. It started with a solo trip. I'd done plenty of those before, sometimes for just a day, sometimes for a week. This one was supposed to be 3 days, nothing too ambitious. I picked a trail deep in the national forest, one that wasn't too far from my usual spots but remote enough to avoid crowds. I liked that kind of solitude. I checked the map the night before, plotted my route, and packed everything. Extra layers, my tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a water filter, and a well-worn first aid kit. I was ready, or so I thought. The first day went exactly as planned. The trail was narrow but easy to follow, winding up through thick pine forests before opening into a long ridge with a view that stretched for miles. I stopped there to take it all in. The sky was clear, and the air smelled sharp with pine and earth. Everything felt right. I made camp just off the ridge, set up my tent in a small clearing, and cooked a quick dinner over my tiny stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped fast. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep to the sounds of the wind whispering through the trees. I woke up once during the night, stirred by some noise I couldn't quite place. Maybe an animal moving through the brush. I listened for a minute, heart thudding in my chest. But when the noise didn't come back, I let myself relax and drifted off again. Day 2, I hit the trail early the next morning, feeling refreshed. The ridge continued for a few more miles before dropping into a dense valley. The air was colder here, and the sunlight barely broke through the thick canopy. Everything felt darker, quieter. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. The map I was following, an official one from the Park Service, showed the trail turning west and climbing back up toward another ridge. But the path in front of me didn't match. Kept heading straight, deeper into the valley. I pulled out my compass to double check. West should have been off to my right, but the trail didn't bend that way. I stood there for a minute, scanning the trees, trying to make sense of it. Trails don't just disappear or change direction. I thought maybe I'd missed the turnoff, so I backtracked for a while, but I didn't see any other paths. After 10 minutes of searching, I figured it had to be a mistake on the map. Trails get rerouted all the time due to erosion or fallen trees. No big deal. I just follow this path and keep an eye on my compass. Worst case, I could always turn back the way I came. But as I walked, the feeling in my gut started to shift. Something about the trail felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on why. The trees grew closer together here, their trunks thick and gnarled. Moss clung to everything, and the air felt damp, heavy. I kept walking, telling myself it was just another stretch of forest, nothing to be worried about. But the deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps and breathing. The first sign of trouble by midday, I knew I'd made a mistake. The trail didn't lead back up toward the ridge. It just kept winding deeper into the valley, twisting and turning until I had no idea which direction I was facing anymore. I pulled out my map again, but it was useless now. None of the landmarks matched. I decided to turn back, retrace my steps to where I'd camped the night before. It was the safest option. But after an hour of walking, I hadn't found the ridge. The trail looked the same, but something was off. I stopped to catch my breath, trying to stay calm. My heart was beating too fast, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. I was lost. Not hopelessly lost, not yet, but close. I forced myself to think logically. I still had plenty of daylight left, enough food and water for at least 2 more days. If I couldn't find my way back by nightfall, I'd set up camp and try again in the morning. A shift in the air, that's when I noticed the smell. It hit me all at once, faint at first, then stronger. A sharp, metallic scent mixed with something rotten. My stomach turned. I'd smelled dead animals in the woods before, deer mostly, but this was different. I followed the smell, half out of curiosity, half out of some instinct I couldn't explain. About 20 yards off the trail, I found it, a pile of bones. At first, I thought it was just a dead deer, but as I got closer, I realized the bones were wrong. Too big to be a deer, too many ribs. The skull was missing, and the bones had been picked clean, scattered in a rough circle. I stood there, staring, trying to make sense of it. A bear, maybe, but the bones didn't look like they'd been chewed or broken. It was like something had stripped the flesh away without touching the bones themselves. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and practically jogged back to the trail. I didn't want to camp anywhere near that place. The descent, I kept moving, faster now, barely noticing the weight of my pack. The trail dipped into a narrow ravine, the sides steep and lined with jagged rocks. I tried not to think about how far I'd gone off course. My only goal was to keep moving, to find higher ground where I could get my bearings. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trail faded in and out, sometimes clear, sometimes disappearing into the underbrush. At one point, I slipped on a patch of wet leaves and went down hard, scraping my hand on a sharp rock. Blood welled up from the cut, and I wrapped it with a bandana, cursing under my breath. The air felt heavier now, thicker. I could barely catch my breath, and my legs felt like lead. It wasn't exhaustion, I'd hiked longer and harder than this before. It felt like the forest itself was pressing in on me, weighing me down. Nightfall, I lost the trail completely as the sun started to set. The light filtering through the trees turned a dull orange, then faded into gray. I didn't want to be out here after dark, but I didn't have a choice. I found a flat spot near a cluster of rocks and set up my tent. My hands were shaking as I worked, every sound in the forest making me jump. I forced myself to eat a little, even though I wasn't hungry, and drank some water. The smell from earlier was still there, faint but unmistakable. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. The forest was pitch black now, and the wind had picked up, rattling the trees. I lay there listening, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. Close, too close. I held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. Another snap, followed by the crunch of leaves. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I gripped my knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. Minutes passed, then hours. The footsteps never came closer, but they didn't move away either. They circled my camp, slow and steady, like something was watching, waiting. I didn't sleep, couldn't. The longest day, when the first light of dawn finally broke, I packed up as fast as I could and started moving. I didn't care which direction, I just wanted to get out. The footsteps were gone, but the forest still felt wrong. The trees seemed closer together than before, their trunks twisted and bent. The trail, when I found it again, was barely recognizable. A thin strip of dirt winding through a tunnel of branches. I pushed on, my legs screaming with every step, my mind a blur of exhaustion and fear. By midday, I was ready to give up. I hadn't seen a single familiar landmark, and the trail seemed to go on forever, looping back on itself. I was trapped. That's when I heard the sound, water, faint but unmistakable. I followed it, hope flickering in my chest for the first time in hours. The sound grew louder, and soon I was standing at the edge of a river. It wasn't on my map, but it didn't matter. Rivers lead to towns, to roads, to safety. I followed the river downstream, my pace quickening. The forest started to thin out, the trees giving way to open ground. The air smelled fresher here, cleaner. And then, just as the sun dipped toward the horizon, I saw it. A dirt road cutting through the trees. I stumbled onto the road, almost crying with relief. I followed it for what felt like miles until I reached a small parking lot with a faded sign and an old truck parked near the edge. A man was loading gear into the back of the truck. He looked up as I approached, his face a mix of surprise and concern. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, too tired to speak. He gave me a lift back to town, and I never went back to that trail again. Aftermath, I've tried to make sense of what happened out there, but some things don't have answers. Maybe I missed a turn and ended up in some forgotten part of the forest. Maybe the bones were just a freak accident, and the footsteps were an animal after all. Or maybe some places aren't meant to be found. Either way, I learned my lesson. The wilderness doesn't care how prepared you think you are. It has its own rules, its own boundaries, and sometimes it lets you know when you've crossed them. I wasn't supposed to be hiking that day. It was early October, and the air had just started to cool. The leaves were turning, coating the trails in red and gold. I had some time off, and my original plan was just to relax at home. But the urge hit me hard that morning. The need to get outside, stretch my legs, and breathe in some fresh air. I wasn't aiming for anything crazy, just a few miles in and back. The trail I picked was unfamiliar to me. I'd heard about it from some coworkers, a long loop up into the hills with great views at the top. Supposedly, it was a well-marked path, but not too crowded. Perfect. I got there around 10 a.m. There were a few cars in the lot, but nothing like the more popular trails nearby. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, double-checked my water, snacks, and phone, then started up the path. The first few miles were peaceful. The trail climbed steadily, winding through thick forest. The leaves crunched under my boots, and every so often, I'd stop to take a sip of water and listen to the quiet. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. I felt good, like I'd made the right choice coming out here. Around mile 4, things started to change. The trail narrowed, the trees pressing in on both sides. The ground was softer here, covered in patches of moss. I noticed it was getting quieter, too. The birds had stopped singing. Even the wind seemed to die down. I shook it off. Trails change as you climb higher. It's normal. Still, something about it felt different. I kept walking. After another half mile, I reached a split in the trail. There was no sign marking the junction, just 2 paths, one leading up, the other cutting off to the right. I paused, trying to decide which way to go. My gut told me to stick with the uphill path. It seemed like the more traveled route. But something about the other trail caught my attention. It looked older, less maintained. There was a strange pull to it, like it had a story of its own. Curiosity got the better of me. I turned right. The path immediately felt different, narrower, rougher, with roots and rocks jutting out at odd angles. It wasn't the kind of trail you'd expect to find on a well-maintained loop. Still, I kept going, telling myself it was probably just an older section of the main trail. After about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker. I stopped and looked around. The trees were taller here, their branches tangled like a canopy overhead. The light was dim, even though it was still early in the afternoon. I checked my phone, no signal. "All right," I said under my breath. "Time to turn back." I spun around and started retracing my steps. Or at least I tried to. The trail looked different on the way back. The roots and rocks seemed more spread out, the ground softer, almost muddy in places. I couldn't tell if I was on the same path anymore. I walked faster, my heartbeat picking up. 15 minutes later, I realized I was lost. Panic started creeping in around the edges. I stopped, took a deep breath, and tried to think logically. I'd been hiking for about 2.5 hours total. If I kept heading downhill, I'd eventually hit the main trail or the parking lot, right? I decided to keep moving. The downhill slope was steep, and I had to catch myself a few times on tree trunks to keep from sliding. The moss underfoot was slick, and my boots kept slipping. After another 20 minutes, I saw something ahead through the trees. A break in the forest. Finally, some kind of clearing. I pushed through the brush and found myself standing on the edge of a wide, rocky slope. It wasn't the trail, but at least it was open. I could see the surrounding hills and valleys from here, though the thick forest stretched on in almost every direction. I scanned the landscape, hoping to catch a glimpse of the parking lot or a road. Nothing, just trees. I stood there for a while, trying to decide what to do. My water was getting low, and my legs were starting to feel heavy. I hadn't seen another person since I left the main trail hours ago. Then I saw it, a faint trail leading down the slope. It wasn't a marked trail, just a narrow strip of flattened grass and dirt. But it was better than nothing. I followed it. The trail wound down the hill, twisting back and forth like it was leading somewhere specific. After a few minutes, I saw something up ahead, a cabin. It was old, the wood gray and weathered. The roof sagged in places and the windows were dark. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. I hesitated. The smart thing to do would be to keep going, try to find the main trail. But part of me thought there might be something useful inside, an old map maybe, or a water source. I walked up to the cabin and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. The inside was dark, musty, and filled with cobwebs. There was a table in the center of the room, a couple of broken chairs, and what looked like an old wood stove in the corner. I stepped inside, my boots thudding on the wooden floor. There was something unsettling about the place. It felt too quiet, like the air was heavier inside. I walked over to the table and brushed off some leaves and dirt. Carved into the wood was a word: help. My stomach dropped. I backed out of the cabin, my pulse racing. Something about the word felt fresh, not old and weathered like the rest of the cabin. I needed to get out of there. I turned and started back down the trail, moving as fast as I could without slipping. The shadows seemed to grow longer as the afternoon wore on. I checked my phone again, still no signal. My legs were burning, and I could feel blisters forming on my heels. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. But the panic was building, pressing down on my chest like a weight. Then I heard it, branches snapping behind me. I froze. The forest was still again. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, but my instincts were screaming at me to move. So I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, the trail spit me out onto a dirt road. Relief flooded through me. The road looked old and barely used, but it was something. I followed it downhill, praying it would lead me back to civilization. An hour later, I stumbled into a clearing and saw the parking lot. My car was still there, the lot nearly empty. I practically collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the dirt on my hands, the same dirt from the table in the cabin. I scrubbed it off, but it felt like it stuck to my skin, a reminder of how close I'd come to something I couldn't quite explain. I haven't been back to that trail since. I'm not sure I ever will. I've always been the type of person who loves a solo hike. There's something about being out there alone that clears my head in a way nothing else can. No noise, no distractions, just the sound of my footsteps on dirt and the rustle of trees around me. This particular trail, a ridge trail I'd been meaning to explore for months, had been on my list for a while. It was remote, tucked away in the heart of a dense forest with no cell service, and promised views that were supposedly worth the climb. It was early fall, the best time for hiking in my opinion. The air was cool and crisp, the leaves were just starting to change color, and the trailhead was practically deserted. Perfect. I had planned for a day hike, something that would take me up and back before sunset. I packed light, just a small backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, my knife, and a map of the area. I like to keep things simple.
No GPS, no fancy gadgets.
Just me, my instincts, and the trail. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail started off flat, winding gently through the forest. The trees were tall and close together, their trunks dark and thick with moss. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in patches, lighting up the ferns and fallen leaves on the ground. It was quiet, aside from the occasional bird call and the crunch of leaves under my boots. I felt good, relaxed, focused. About an hour in, the trail started to climb. It wasn't steep, but it was steady, and I could feel my legs starting to burn as I gained elevation. The air got cooler, and the trees thinned out a bit, giving me glimpses of the valley below. I stopped for a quick water break, leaning against a rock and taking in the view. The forest stretched out below me in every direction, a sea of green and gold. I could see the ridge ahead, a jagged line of rock that cut across the sky. That was my goal, the ridge. Once I got up there, I'd follow the trail along the top for a while, then loop back down to the trailhead. The climb got steeper as I got closer to the ridge. The trail turned rocky, and I had to watch my footing carefully. One wrong step and I could easily twist an ankle or worse. I focused on each step, my breathing steady, my eyes scanning the ground ahead of me. Then, without warning, the trail narrowed. It wasn't marked on the map, but suddenly I was walking along a ledge barely wide enough for 2 feet. To my left, the hillside rose up sharply, a wall of rock and scrubby brush. To my right, the ground dropped away into a steep ravine. I could hear water down there, a stream maybe, but I couldn't see it through the trees. I hesitated, looking back the way I'd come. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day, and I doubted anyone would be coming up behind me. I could turn back now, play it safe, but I was so close to the ridge. I pressed on, moving carefully along the narrow trail. My heart was beating faster now, not from the climb, but from the awareness of how exposed I was. One wrong move, one slip, and I'd be tumbling down into that ravine. I kept my eyes on the trail, trying not to think about the drop. Finally, the trail widened again, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I was back on solid ground, the ridge just a short climb away. I pushed myself up the last stretch, my legs burning, and then I was there. Standing on the ridge, the whole world spread out below me. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out to the horizon, a patchwork of trees and meadows, with a river cutting through it like a silver ribbon. In the distance, I could see mountains, their peaks dusted with snow. The wind was stronger up here, cool and sharp against my face. I felt alive, exhilarated. This was why I hiked, for moments like this. I found a flat rock and sat down, pulling out my water bottle and a protein bar. I ate slowly, savoring the view, letting my body recover from the climb. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. I figured I had about an hour before I needed to start heading back. Plenty of time. I decided to follow the ridge a little farther, just to see what was around the next bend. The trail along the ridge was rough, less maintained than the lower sections. It twisted and turned, sometimes disappearing into patches of scrub before reappearing a few yards ahead. I kept going, curious to see where it led. Then I saw it, a side trail, barely more than a faint path through the brush, branching off from the main trail. It wasn't on the map, but that wasn't unusual. Trails like this popped up all the time, made by animals or by hikers looking for a shortcut. I hesitated, looking down the side trail. It seemed to lead down into the valley, a shortcut that could save me some time on the way back. But it was narrow, overgrown, and steep. Not the safest option, but tempting. I stood there for a moment, weighing my options. The main trail was longer, but it was safe and familiar. The side trail was risky, but it could be faster. In the end, I decided to take the side trail. I figured I'd go down a little way, see how it looked, and turn back if it got too sketchy. First, it wasn't too bad. The trail was steep, but manageable. I moved slowly, picking my way down the slope, using my hands to steady myself on the rough ground. But the farther I went, the worse it got. The trail grew narrower and steeper, the ground loose and crumbly under my feet. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree root, my heart pounding in my chest. I thought about turning back, but the idea of climbing back up that slope seemed even worse. I kept going, telling myself it would level out soon, that I'd reach the bottom and find an easier way back to the main trail. I was wrong. The trail didn't level out. It got steeper, the trees closing in around me, the ground slick with fallen leaves. I couldn't see the bottom anymore, just an endless slope disappearing into the shadows below. My legs were shaking now, my knees threatening to buckle with every step. I was using my hands more than my feet, grabbing at roots and branches to keep myself from sliding. Then I slipped. It wasn't a big fall, just a few feet, but it was enough. I landed hard on my side, the wind knocked out of me, my left leg twisted beneath me. Pain shot through my ankle, sharp and immediate. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to assess the damage. My ankle throbbed, but it didn't feel broken. I could move it, but putting weight on it was out of the question. I sat up, my heart sinking as I looked around. The trail was barely visible now, just a faint line through the undergrowth. The sun was lower in the sky, the shadows growing longer and darker. I was in trouble. I knew I had to stay calm, think clearly. Panicking wouldn't help. I pulled out my map, trying to figure out where I was. The main trail was somewhere above me, but I had no idea how far. The valley was below, but it was steep and overgrown, and I didn't know what was down there. I tried to stand, testing my weight on my injured ankle. Pain shot through me, and I had to grab a tree to keep from falling. There was no way I was walking out of here. I sat back down, my mind racing. I had a whistle in my pack, a safety precaution I always carried but had never used. I pulled it out and blew 3 short blasts, the universal signal for help. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and piercing. I listened, straining for a response. Nothing. I blew the whistle again, louder this time. Still nothing. The forest was silent, the trees pressing in around me, the shadows deepening with every passing minute. I knew I couldn't stay here all night. It would get cold, and I wasn't prepared for an overnight stay. My best chance was to keep moving slowly and carefully, following the trail, or what was left of it, down into the valley. I tore a strip of fabric from my shirt and wrapped it around my ankle as tightly as I could, creating a makeshift brace. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. I found a sturdy branch to use as a crutch and started hobbling down the trail. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep going. One step at a time. The light was fading fast, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with every passing minute. I kept blowing my whistle at regular intervals, hoping someone, anyone, would hear me. Then, just as the last light was fading from the sky, I saw it. A flicker of movement through the trees. A flashlight. Relief flooded through me as the light grew closer, and I heard the sound of footsteps on the trail. "Are you okay?" A voice called out. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, and the hiker, an older man with a weathered face and a kind smile, helped me to my feet. "You're lucky I heard your whistle," he said, guiding me back to the main trail. "It's easy to get lost out here." He helped me back to the trailhead, where his car was parked. He offered me a ride back to town, and I gladly accepted. As we drove, I looked back at the ridge, now just a dark silhouette against the sky. I had learned my lesson the hard way. Sometimes the best adventure is knowing when to turn back. And sometimes being found is the best ending you could hope for.